Hello, today's Bible study comes from John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, and reads as follows. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him. And he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap, in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Then they kept on questioning him. He straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first. Until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," he said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." This one I like, this passage, because there's a lot in this that we don't look at. So let's get to it. Um, Everyone else had gone to their house, at this time, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And when he came back in the morning, he came again. And where'd he go? To the temple. And all the people came to him and sat down and he taught them. Jesus had put it to his people who didn't believe in him and preached so hard at the temple that they went their own ways. They were like, what went on? People were confounded by Jesus' teaching. So Jesus went to the Mount of Olives to sleep. He went and laid down and rested his body and his spirit. Um, oh man. So Jesus was returning in this situation, and he was coming back, and it tells you when he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. Jesus was doing what he always was doing. Um, Jesus was in Jerusalem a few days after the Feast of Tabernacles. He didn't leave right away. And the authorities there wanted him silenced because Jesus was messing them up. And they wanted to arrest him, but it wasn't his time to be arrested. They couldn't touch him. But Jesus stood boldly. So when you think he left for a minute or he went around or he didn't get there when they went, it wasn't, like I said before, if you look at the other videos, because of confidence or being afraid, it wasn't his time. But then it tells you right now that he boldly was teaching, and I mean crowds. And he was doing it in public. He wasn't hiding it. He wasn't saying, "Hey, let me put this under a bushel." Jesus was out there in the temple preaching. So they bring this woman to Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees. They brought him a woman caught in adultery. Uh-oh. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery." In the very act, now Moses and the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? Well, first of all, this was something they was trying to publicly catch Jesus. And while Jesus was publicly teaching in the temple courts, they wanted to do it in public and make it as public as possible to quote unquote embarrass him and show him up, you know. And they also were trying to embarrass this woman. Now you notice they didn't bring the man and or the other woman that she was committing with. It doesn't say who she was committing adultery with, male or female. It just said that she was caught in adultery. Well, in order for her to be caught in adultery, she had to be with somebody else to be doing the adultery. And these men brought this situation to Jesus' lap. And in my mind, it sounded like these men had personal problems with this woman. Because why would you have to bring just her and not the other party? You just brought the woman. You didn't bring the other party. And I'm just going to go with that the other party was a man. You didn't bring him. You brought her. So what you were saying is it's okay for us, the dudes, but that woman, it wasn't good for her. And then you want to do it all loud and boastful and in public. You didn't make this a discretionary type of situation. You didn't go hide off or say, Jesus, can we talk to you on the side? You brought her out in public so you could embarrass her and try to show up Jesus. But no, you could have held her somewhere and said, let us bring this to you and see what he says, and then go back to her. You didn't even do that. You went and got her and brought her there. And you shamed her because you said she was caught. Well, it would actually mean they were caught. And they might say this was something that she was always doing, and they finally bringing it to Jesus' attention, but she still had to do it with somebody else. So the woman was caught in adultery, in the very act of adultery, because that's what it says, she was caught into adultery. Now, one, you had to do this against her will. You were bringing her against her will, and who was bringing her? Did you see who was bringing her? These perfect people, the scribes and the Pharisees, these ones that were without sin. Please know I am being as sarcastic as I possibly can without cracking up, because they weren't perfect and they were already scheming to try to trick Jesus. So you knew they weren't any good and they were up to no good. You can't bring somebody else's sins to the Lord. Only the Lord and that person deal with their sin. That's their relationship. It ain't yours. You can pray on them. You can ask for it. But they have to give their sins to the Lord. They have to repent to the Lord. So it was a man involved. So they threw in Moses in the law, commanding that such should be stoned. And yeah, it was a capital offense under the Jewish law. But but it had to be observed by all these people. Remember that. So they said to Jesus, I'm sorry, it was a capital offense, I should say, and it had to be observed by all these people in order to do it. So then they asked Jesus, what do you say, man? Hey, Jesus, what do you say? It was a trap. We knew it was a trap. He wanted to hear Jesus say executor, killer, whatever that law Moses set do. And you know what? Moses was great. Jesus is just that much greater. So look at how Jesus flips the script. They said, testing him, that they might have something on which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger as though he did not hear them. Woo! So they were using this woman as a weapon against Jesus, and they brought her to him, and Jesus just started writing in the dirt. And if they were really paying attention, adultery can't be committed by one person. If you caught her in the act, then you caught another person in the act. So in my mind, they weren't looking at this woman as they should have. She was an object, a thing. And they were trying to get her to be the test and the correct answer for them from Jesus. But Jesus just stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger. And this was probably something Jesus was probably in his head saying, just let me do this. Looking at these dudes come up here with this nonsense, knowing that one, if she was committing adultery, it needed to be with somebody else. So he stooped down and with Jesus' humility, because he was humble, Jesus didn't flip out in anger or didn't go crazy in outrage. He didn't scream at the woman. Uh-oh, you mean Jesus got mercy and compassion and grace? Uh-oh. And he's showing it. So he stooped down in a low posture. And that was probably to get on the level where they had this woman, because they wasn't treating her as a human being. They had her more as an object. Jesus was identifying with the woman and still caring for her and knowing that they had embarrassed her and knowing that they were not treating her correctly because they left out the other party. So Jesus was writing on the ground. And kind of like he didn't hear him. So they get a little pushy because they want to know. And they were doing a wicked thing here. Don't bring somebody else's sins to the Lord when you have your own. Or as he says, how can you see the speck in my eye when you got the plank in your own eye? So they continued asking him. He raised himself up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. So they were steadily asking him, but Jesus, love him, love him, love him. He stood up and he said to him, all right, you perfect beings, you ones that have never sinned, how you caught her in the act, you had to be at least observing it or looking on it more than likely. If you don't have a sin, then you stone her. Pick it up. I dare you, pick it up and stone her. And then he went back to the ground. He went back to being humble. He went back to where the woman was at. And they continued to ask him. So he raised himself up and said to them, Jesus said this directly to him, of the woman. He said, hey, if you got it, if you ain't done nothing, then throw a stone at her first. If you ain't got any sin, do it. So then he went down back to the ground, and when he came up this time, check this out. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one. The oldest ones. The oldest ones in the word. The knowledgeable ones. The one who have been studying this word for the longest and have been in charge of it for a long time. They left first. And then to the last. And Jesus was sitting there, left alone, stooping there, and the woman standing in the midst. They had been convicted by their own conscience because they weren't without sin. They had sins of their own. And then all Jesus does is what he tells us. He challenged the woman not to sin anymore. When he raised himself up and saw that no one was there but the woman, he knew the accusers were going to be gone. And then he asked the woman, where are those accusers of yours? They gone. Has no one condemned you? The only one that could condemn her was the one that was asking her questions. And he didn't condemn her. She said, no. No one, Lord. The woman was guilty of sin, probably. But the ones that accused her couldn't do nothing for it. She knew the goodness of having no condemnation. She wasn't being condemned for this. She was forgiven for a death sentence and had a new opportunity at life. And then to have Jesus say, neither do I condemn you. Jesus put her guilt upon himself. And when he stooped down, he was at her level. He was where she was at. And then he just said what he says. Go and sin no more. What he was saying is, daughter, you are forgiven. I love you. You have been shown grace and mercy, and go be better. Amen.